Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for dialing in. Glad to see you all joining us today. As you're coming in, please make sure you rename yourself so that we know who's with us today. Give us your state and what group that you're with so that we can have a chance to meet you, interact with you. And today's going to be a very interactive conversation. We are very excited about where we're headed with the discussion today. So please make sure again that you are listed as a participant with your state or your group. And we're going to have an opportunity to engage you in today's conversation and have you actually help us shape this conversation that we're going to have around states as model employers. We still have several folks dialing in and connecting to audio, but I am Pam Goins, Executive Director here at NASCA. If this is the first time that you have been with a NASCA event, we are the National Association of State Chief Administrators. These are the governor-appointed cabinet level officials who run the business of government. And most of their customers are internal, agency to agency, but also always striving to ensure the best for the citizens and constituents of the states. So we're excited to have you here with NASCA today. This is a conversation that we are continuing around states as model employers, and we are so excited to be a partner with SEED, the State Exchange on Employment and Disability. And you'll see on our screen today, 3 of our key partners, Katya Albanese, Rachel McGravy, and Bobby Silverstein, all whom work directly with the SEED initiative across the country. And again, we are thrilled and excited to be a partner with them. So we're working through a state collaborative. And you might ask what that is. Well, it's when we bring our state members together for a conversation around a very distinct topic. And so we're building a set of recommendations and a toolkit with some case studies that you can take back and work within your states. We're going to talk today a little bit about legislation, executive orders, but really start to unpack the implementation phase. And so one of the things that NASCA members do is to ensure best practices are occurring at that implementation level. So again, as we're shaping this conversation around what can states use, we really want to hear from you, not only where are you in your own journey, becoming state as a model employer through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion in disability employment. So we've got Bobby here with us today. He's already on the screen with us. We're going to unpack a little bit. What does it even mean to be a model employer? And then we'll go right into some of the key components of that. And again, we hope you'll engage on chat. We'll hope you'll unmute yourself and find an opportunity to engage with us. Today is just purely a conversation. It's a learning experience for SEED and for NASCA as we're creating this conversation leading up to this toolkit, which we hope you will find extremely beneficial over the course of time. So again, we have a great group with us, over 40 folks here on the call today. So thank you so much for dialing in. And Bobby, let me turn it over to you to maybe help us understand what does it even mean when we say states are model employers?
Great, thanks. Next slide, please. We're all in the midst of a focus or a refocus on how to make sure that our culture, the climate is diverse and inclusive. And the D&I initiative has been around for years. But what we have found based on research over the years is oftentimes that may not have included people with disabilities in the initiative, or if they were included, they sometimes were an afterthought. And what the State Exchange on Employment People with Disabilities SEED project is doing is actually uncovering a lot of best promising and emerging practices from around the country that states are adopting and implementing that expand D&I to include not only race and ethnicity and gender, but also include people with disabilities. And under the phrase state as a model employer, there have been developed by states around the country a couple of core strategies that we wanted to talk about today. And we've kind of divided them into these 5 core strategies: the establishment of formal mechanisms and a infrastructure for implementation, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility plans and initiatives. Third, the adoption of best promising and emerging practices with respect to recruitment, hiring, retention, and advancement. The issue of accessibility of websites, online systems, and mobile apps, particularly the online systems. Folks are moving a lot to, in terms of the application for jobs. Oftentimes it's now online. How do we make sure that the online systems are accessible? And fifth, disability awareness training of state personnel. So those are the 5 core strategies, and we want to kind of delve into each of them. So next slide, please. The first one is formal mechanisms and infrastructure. States are adopting policies to make them model employers of people with disabilities through legislation, as well as through executive orders. And at the bottom, we've listed a number of the states that have actually adopted this. Again, some states have done both legislation and executive orders. Maryland, for example, has established a cabinet level position by legislation, disability. So disability is at the table when the cabinet meets on a bunch of issues. Ohio has opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities Agency, which is responsible for making sure that other state agencies know best promising and emerging practices. In a number of states, we've had interagency task force, working groups, advisory committees, and coordinators that have been the groups established. A number of states have established state as a model employee task force to systematically look at that issue, both in terms of policy and in terms of implementation strategies. Stay on that previous slide, please. Yep. Pam, you're on mute.
Technology. You think you'd learn after 2 years. Bobby, I appreciate the overview, especially as we're talking about pieces of legislation, direct policy, executive orders that are coming down across the country. And you all are certainly seeing some of that key language across the board. And Bobby, I'm going to ask a follow-up, and then I would love to put some of our state members ask if you would go off mute and share some of your thoughts as well. I know we've got folks from Alaska, Illinois, Kentucky, Pennsylvania. I saw all of those joining on today's call. But Bobby, are there some key pieces within these policy sets that are important for us to think about? Key language, key terms, key phrases that you would like to share with the group?
We go from language like Tennessee, which says you shall establish a state as a model employer policy, period. That's the extent of the guidance. To New Jersey, that passed legislation, I think it was January 19th it was signed, or of 2022, that lists a comprehensive set of directives, which are aligned with those 5. So it ranges from generally do it to make sure you cover a whole bunch of specific issues. Now, Pennsylvania, I don't know, there's a bill pending right now in Pennsylvania, kind of modeled after a little bit of Maryland, to actually have a cabinet level position to coordinate a lot of the activities in the state. So the policy, the executive orders, again, some of the task forces that are established are time limited. They want you to develop a plan, and then the state agencies and the governor execute it. In others, they're ongoing. Massachusetts in 2020 established a permanent commission on the status of persons with disabilities, so that would be an ongoing entity to help make sure that the policies are being implemented.
Thank you, Bobby. And again, I think that's really important as we're starting to shape the practice component of that, to really hear what some of those key components are within the policy set as well. And again, I would love for some of our states to come on, and if you don't mind, I'm going to call on a couple of you all to just share what you're seeing. And you may be early in your journey, and that's absolutely fine for you to share that. But I'm going to start out with Pennsylvania. Beth, Hattie, do you all have anything you want to share on where the bills are in your state, maybe where you all are as far as just beginning implementation? Anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, because Pennsylvania has an employment first policy, and they have a commission and an advisory committee, which give annual reports in terms of the status of the employment of people with disability in the state.
Hi, Pam. This is Beth Christian from Pennsylvania. I can't give you the update on the legislation, but what I can tell you is in the Department of General Services, we've recently brought Hattie on board as our, I'm going to mess up her title, so I'm going to have Hattie unmute and tell us her title. But her whole specialty and her whole reason for being here is to work on DE&I initiatives. And it's one of the first positions of this kind in Pennsylvania. So Hattie, if you want to introduce yourself, I'm really excited for you to be on this call.
Thanks, Beth, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Hattie McCarter. I'm the Equity Management Program Coordinator for the Department of General Services, where we're housed in the Bureau of Diversity and Inclusion of Small Business Opportunities. I recently came on board. However, I used to work for the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. I want to say about for 10 years. So I am familiar with some forms of the bill, but I can't really give any specifics on that. But one of our programs within DGS is to foster a diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and if we want to tackle an accessible lens for all of our staff who we encounter, in addition to our customers and our stakeholders, we have been doing a lot in this space since I've gotten on board, to where we're really able to reflect on what it means to be inclusive and making sure that our staff and our stakeholders have equitable access to things that they need in order to be productive in their job, but also working with our communities as well. So once again, I'm not too familiar with the bill that's within PA, but I know just in working with OVR, we did a lot for accessibilities and working with people with disabilities and helping them maintain employment and their independence. So I definitely understand the significance and making sure as far as the accessibility piece. So thanks.
Thank you, Hattie, for sharing that, and especially on the chief administrative side and the teams that work with our CAOs. A lot of times the legislation, goes on a separate side of the world, and then you get the language and you're told to implement, which is exactly why we're having conversations like this today. So certainly understand if no one on the call is deeply intimately familiar with the legislation, but it's just helpful to know where you are in your state. And Bobby, Hattie actually brought up a really important piece. You know, we were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're seeing belonging put onto that acronym now, but we're also seeing access or accessibility. And I know, Bobby, you use that DEINA. You want to share any more about how that is kind of shaping that new terminology?
Sure, that's an interesting political decision. DEIA is now the acronym that is used in President Biden's Executive Order 14035. And there is some debate, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And I think it's a good thing, but it could be a bad thing. And this is what I mean by that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion should, by definition, include people with disabilities. But oftentimes, as I said, it is not included, or it's an afterthought. Just last week, Hollywood, there was a University of Southern California, I think, did a comprehensive review of diversity and inclusion in Hollywood. And guess what wasn't included? People with disabilities. And there's a big advocacy effort to get it included. But accessibility has two components. One is to send the message that people with disabilities should be included, but also accessibility is a specific term of art that deals with virtual and physical space, the websites, online systems, as well as physical. So if you say, oh, and with disability is the A, it really isn't. It's sending the message that your initiative should be inclusive of people with disabilities, and also make sure that part of that is web and physical accessibility. I don't know if that helps.
That's very helpful, and I appreciate that. Let me just pause really quickly and say to Tammy on our team, can we just unmute everyone from your end? It sounds like there may be a little bit of issue with not having the capacity for our individual members to unmute themselves. We want to make sure that everyone has a chance to share. So Tammy, if you're able to help us with that, that would be great. In the meantime, let me see if I can get anyone from Alaska, Illinois, or Kentucky to share where they are in their state. I know you all have been listed here as a state example, but any of those three states, or perhaps Virginia, Maryland, Illinois, would you all share where you all are in your journeys? While we're trying to get Sandy unmuted as well.
See, while you're trying to do that, it'd be interesting for some of those states that you mentioned, like Alaska, is in the middle of a task force looking at state as a model employer right now. The question is, have you all been involved in that process? Louisiana did that. Kentucky was the first one to have a task force in 2018. What involvement did you folks have in some of these initiatives? Tennessee is doing it right now. New Jersey is doing it right now, just starting.
Hello, can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. This is Sandy Phipps from Virginia. I'm sorry, I can't see anybody on my screen except for the speaker, and I couldn't find myself to even unmute myself. But anyway, so my name is Sandy Phipps. I'm from Virginia. I was just hired in into what's called our Pathways Grant, which is a 5-year grant where I am the liaison with our vocational rehab and Department for Human Resource Management. Today is actually the first day that our alternative hiring process has started. I started working on the policy, I guess back in January or February when I was first hired. And it is being implemented today, April 5th. Our process right now is for individuals with disabilities to, well, our legislation, I'm sorry, let me go back. Our legislation, which was adopted in July, wanted us to develop an alternative hiring process for people with disabilities to increase the amount of individuals with disabilities being employed in state government. So the process that we are starting out with is for those individuals to get what's called a certificate of disability, which you could maybe compare it to a Schedule A letter for the federal government, where they can get that certificate from vocational rehabilitation in Virginia that they can upload or attach to their employment application, which is going to help them move up the ladder a little bit to have some priority consideration for interviews. So right now I am in the process also of getting all of the logistical information out of the way. We have a link that a person can click onto to request that certificate. That link comes to me. Right now, I am the point of contact. And then depending upon where that person lives within the state, will determine which office they will go to get their certificate. If they are currently a consumer with Voc Rehab, we don't need additional documentation to give them a certificate. If they are not currently in vocational rehab, then they will need to provide their medical and or mental health documentation. So it's pretty exciting. And that is my story for today.
Sandy, that's very, very helpful. And of course, on our first call that we had a few weeks ago, we had the Commonwealth with us and certainly sharing what was happening there. So we appreciate you continuing the conversation with us here today. Before we move on to the next core strategy, are there other states that might be interested in sharing where you are in your journey? Again, I know we've got Alaska, Kentucky, Illinois, Maryland, others on the call. Would you like to share anything before we move on? All right, you all don't have to be shy all afternoon, I promise. Bobby, let's move on then to the second core strategy, and then we'll get some more conversation going with that.
Sure. A number of states, as part of the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion effort, have adopted formal strategic plans. And prior to the DEI component, they might have under the rubric of affirmative action plans. And a number of them have hiring goals and specific policies for voluntary self-identification for people with disabilities. As part of, if you're going to have a goal, you need to be able to identify whether or not you have a disability and have a procedure. Part of the strategic plans are doing workforce analysis, and sometimes there are data to make sure the practices are data-driven, to have surveys, studies, and then many of these state policies, some through legislation, some through executive orders, also have reporting mechanisms. And we kind of have pulled all this together in a phrase, it's a management phrase, which we've modified a little bit, is what gets measured and reported and has consequences gets done. And this is the mechanism, the procedure that a number of states have adopted. Some states have actual specific goals for people with disabilities. And in those states, there are specific reports that not only include the racial and ethnic and gender makeup of the workforce, but also include specific demographic information related to disability.
Yeah, Bobby, and again, I think that's really important as we're hearing how the states are tracking this, like what that recruitment process looks like to begin with. And then once they're on board, the retainment and the advancement components are critically important as well. Again, would welcome anyone on the call to share your thoughts around this core strategy, or if you want to drop it in the chat as well, that's also very helpful just to hear what's happening in the other states. I am curious though, of anyone on the call, are you using a formal like data dashboard or a employee survey as you're doing your recruitment process? Let's just look at the front end of disability employment. Are any of your states looking and tracking that data on the number of applicants from people with disabilities? Anybody want to share some thoughts around that? Or Bobby, any states that you're aware of that are doing a really nice job of capturing this through a data dashboard?
I don't have that level of detail to know if they are doing that. But Missouri, Minnesota, Louisiana, Minnesota all have executive orders that require specific goals for people with disabilities. And in order to do that, you need to have a procedure for self-identification. So I'm not sure in terms of if they actually have data on applicants, but this is data on hiring, and some also have it for advancement, but I'm not sure about the recruitment.
Great. All right. So I'm seeing some information in chat too about starting diversity councils, utilizing the surveys here in Kentucky. Looks like Kentucky is just now starting to do that analysis of really what that looks like. So that's helpful. Bobby, as we're thinking about the recruitment component of this, you know, a lot of, and you all may not be looking at this from the SEED perspective, but at least from the NASCA members, we've talked a lot about blind interviewing, blind applications, from the perspective of not knowing exactly the individual who is applying to a position. And there's a lot of controversial conversation happening over that. Like, do we want to ask everything about a person as they're coming in? Has SEED been looking at the hiring practices from the types of questions that are being asked on an application? Do you all have any information to share on best practices in that component?
Well, in general, there are issues and how a state views the questioning at the pre-employment stage. The ADA prohibits pre-employment inquiries about disability because there was a time where the first question on an application, I'm being rhetorical here, was, do you have a disability? And the second question is, did you go to Harvard? You never got to the second question. You stopped at the first question. That is prohibited by the ADA, except there are voluntary and mandatory affirmative action where you are allowed to voluntarily develop affirmative action programs, or in some cases, they are mandatory per state legislation or executive orders. In either case, in those situations, you are allowed to proactively hire or ask questions, but they have to be voluntary. They have to be, there's a set of 4 or 5 things that you have to do. Make sure that it's clear, it's not, there's no adverse consequences if you don't say that. It's separate from the application form. So you can, if you want to, affirmatively hire people with disabilities. You can do so. You just have to be careful, and I can send you another document called Taking Disability into Consideration in terms of what is and is not permissible and how to do that. And we can certainly get that to you. But while we're talking about that issue, are states, are your colleagues developing using artificial intelligence as part of this process of application? Because in the screening process, there's some really scary problems from algorithm bias against people with disabilities. If you have AI, the recruiting, the initial stages is done through artificial intelligence, and somebody who's blind is not making eye contact, and the algorithm includes the extent of eye contact, you're totally excluding people who are blind. If it's the voice tone is a factor in the algorithm, and you have somebody who's hearing impaired or deaf who might speak a little differently, are they going to be excluded from participation? So the issue of, are you using AI in the initial hiring stages is a very big issue from a disability perspective.
And Bobby, I'm glad you brought that up. I had never made that connection between AI recruitment and how that might play a role with people with disabilities. Sylvia, thank you so much for dropping the information from California. I don't know if you're interested in expanding on that to your colleagues, but I'm really intrigued by the recruitment and retainment plan that you might have in the state. I certainly understand the self-identification survey that you use as you're tracking your applicants, but I'm just curious if you might share a little bit more about that process. If your numbers do fall too low, like what does that plan even look like? How do you look and seek out people with disabilities? Are you able to share anything with us today?
I'm driving, so pardon me if you hear my car in the background. So within our department, we've never fallen below the parity number, so we've not had to deal with that yet. But I do know that there is, we have the Office of Civil Rights within California state government, and that office is responsible for ensuring that departments that do fall below that parity number have a plan in place and that they are making progress on that plan so that they can hire people and retain people that have disabilities.
I appreciate you sharing that. We heard from Joe Xavier on our last call, sharing some of the other work there in California. So you all got some great things going on. Thank you, and safe travels. Braden, thank you so much. Sorry you don't have a microphone today. I appreciate what's happening there in Illinois. I had heard about the piece of legislation that was passed as well. So we want to dig more into that when we have a chance to hear from you. So Bobby, let's move on to the third core strategy and share a little bit more with those on the call.
Sure. This is promising practices for recruitment and hiring. And Sandy just shared the second most recent state to adopt a fast-track hiring authority or alternative hiring authority. Another state that is in the process of implementing a new legislation is New Jersey. I don't know if they're on the phone, but they have also just established this. But there are states like Alaska who have been doing this for years and years. Maryland has a program where what you're basically doing is allowing the state agencies to hire folks with disabilities without going through the typical civil service hiring process. It allows for, you want to make sure that the people have disabilities, they're qualified, but you have set up an alternative policy approach or policy or practice for the hiring of people with disabilities. And again, Alaska has been doing this for years, as has Maryland, Illinois, Nevada. Again, New Jersey is in the process now of developing its implementation strategy, because that legislation was just passed and signed into law in January.
Yeah, and I know Alaska has been working diligently in this area. I know we've got someone on the call. I don't know if you're interested in sharing more. I'm curious, Bobby, we talked a lot about the policy component, but I'm also curious more around the training. And this is to our states on the call too. And Bobby, Katia, Rachel, if you've got examples, would love to hear. How are states going about the training component with their HR teams? This is a different process. It's an expedited, it's the fast track. Do you have any examples of how our states are working within their teams to train the HR staff to ensure that they're looking at these applicants in a modified fashion?
The folks from Alaska probably begin at that level. Hopefully the folks you have from Alaska, Maryland, Illinois, Nevada, who have been doing this for years can better answer that question, I think, Pam. Pennsylvania is considering legislation. They have not enacted it yet.
Anyone on the call interested in sharing what's happening in your state?
So this is Sandy again from Virginia. That is my next step now, to educate all VR and HR on the alternative hiring process. And I believe the Department for Human Resource Management is having a recruitment symposium in May, where myself and David Leon, who was on the call, I think last month with NASCA, to actually talk about this process and to also talk about windmills training, which is training to help, change your perception of hiring individuals with disabilities. But obviously we have a lot of offices within the state. So that's a good way to start. And then I'm assuming I would need to, be the salesperson and reach out to as many agencies as I can one-on-one. But if other states have a different process that they're going through, I would love to learn about those.
Now, in addition to this alternative hiring process, in some states have hiring preferences for people with disabilities and or disabled vets. Vermont has a mandatory interview program where if a person meets minimum qualifications, they have to at least be interviewed. Sandy is talking in Virginia about an expedited certification process so that it's easy if you're going to use a preference or alternative appointment list, that the agencies know that you're a person with a disability. You don't have to go with that additional process of trying to figure that out, which often is perceived as a burden. So like Sandy said, they said VR. VR is used to figuring out if you're a person with a disability. If the VR agency is responsible, you get a certificate, end of story. With respect to mandatory interviews or hiring preferences. Montana put something in the chat room. I have in my documents that Montana has a policy that requires that individuals with disabilities be hired over individuals without, when the two are substantially equal in qualifications for an eligible initial hiring position. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. This is John Paveo from the state of Montana, state ADA coordinator, equal opportunity officer. We do have in statute provisions for disability employment preference in hiring, and also preference for veterans and disabled veterans, eligible family members. And as Bobby indicated, it's for the persons with disabilities employment preference. Again, you're looking at the two individuals that are substantially equal in qualifications. And if the person has requested disability employment preference, that person is to be hired over the other applicant. If for veterans, disabled veterans, it's slightly different. If the agency is using a scoring process, they're required to apply 5 to 10 percentage points, depending whether it's a veteran, disabled veteran, or eligible family member. Or it's similar to the persons with disability employment preference, where it could be, again, a comparison between two applicants who are substantially equal. The veteran, disabled veteran, or eligible relative would be chosen over the other applicant.
Now, do we have folks from Colorado on the phone, Pam? You're on mute.
I'm so sorry. My dog was talking in the background. I haven't seen anyone from Colorado join on today. I do want to hang on to John, though, if we can, for just 1 second. I know Sandy dropped a question in the chat asking, are there no interviews involved in Montana?
This is John Paveo again, state of Montana. There is no requirement right now for interviews, but again, as we go through the screening process, it comes down to the final candidates. If one has disability employment preference, then that person gets the position, but there's no requirement to afford interviews to individuals who request preference.
That's helpful. And Kelly, thank you so much. That's great information from Alaska in the chat as well. I appreciate that. She's talking a little bit about their training program. And then there have been some questions back and forth around windmills too. Ricky, thank you for sharing what's happening there in Louisiana and Sunday. I know Tennessee is still a little early in your journey, but can definitely learn from all those on the call as well.
And there are a number of states that have these preferences for disabled vets: Arizona, Florida, Nevada, Oregon, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Wyoming, to name a few of them. And in terms of mandatory interviews, Maryland also has it for disabled vets, mandatory interview.
Great. Thank you all so much. Bobby, this is great information, great back and forth in the chat. Thank you all. In the interest of time, Bobby, let's move on to our 4th core strategy and make sure we can get 4 and 5
Sure.
in.
The 4th is really, this is, I guess, maybe part of the 3rd. This is promising practices, retention, and advancement. A number of states, Massachusetts, Minnesota, as exemplars, have what's called a centralized reasonable accommodation fund. And this is a big deal for you folks. Think about a hiring manager in a particular office, at lowest program operating component. They interview Harvard grad who has significant disabilities, needs all kinds of technology and accommodations. If they have to pay the accommodations out of their pocket, out of their budget, and they have a second person who is similarly qualified, not number 1, number 2, but close, why would they hire number 1 if they have to have a hit on their budget? So a number of states have said, we don't want to have that issue of cost and of accommodations as part of the equation. So they develop, either at the agency level or at the state level, an accommodation fund, so that you're just making the decision based on the merits, not based on the cost of accommodations. Now, other strategies, there's a number of states that have ADA coordinators and others have actually centralized the reasonable accommodation expertise, so that particularly with respect to technology, if they don't know something exists, they have an expert, a go-to person who can help answer those questions. And in some states, it's a go-to office. Then you have issues of telework now for state employees. Delaware has a stay at work, return to work coordinator, because they have found that that when people get ill or injured on the job, if they don't come back or have a contact within 3, 4, or 5 weeks, there's often they're gone. So Delaware, for example, has a coordinator. Number of states have developed guides for stay at work, return to work. Council of State Governments has a toolkit on stay at work, return to work that has all kinds of different examples. State of Washington, again, I don't know if they're on the call, they are the exemplar in terms of stay at work, return to work. And then you have personal care services. There are people with the most significant disabilities who may need help in toileting, eating, dressing. A number of some states have developed policies for these folks that are aligned with the recent update to the Section 501 reg that deals with non-discrimination affirmative action in the federal government, which requires, as a form of affirmative action, personal assistance services.
Bobby, maybe a question for you, both with the third and the fourth core strategy here that we've been talking around recruitment, retention, and advancement. How have you seen, from the SEED perspective, the global health pandemic impact states as they're trying to bring on individuals with disabilities? We know we've got the Great Resignation. States are just grappling with huge unemployment, vacancies, and they just can't fill positions. How have you seen this opportunity for remote work or hybrid opportunities that may need accommodations? What are you all seeing from the SEED landscape around changes with the pandemic?
Well, the SEED project did a special collaborative on COVID-19 and developed a series of frameworks for ensuring that the efforts by states were disability inclusive. So given the time, Katia will include a link for you all of the documents that we did that dealt specifically with return to the workplace, hybrid workplace, telework, making certain that the health and safety plans for returning to the workplace were in fact disability inclusive. So there's a whole framework that was developed around that issue, Pam.
Great. And thank you, Katia, for dropping that in the chat. I appreciate it. Bobby, there is a question in the chat too around the centralized accommodation funds. Where are those funds being driven from? Where are they coming from?
They're earmarked, it's line item budget in the budget.
State budget.
For the fund in Minnesota and Massachusetts. What I don't know for sure is, are state agencies developing their own? We have come across in our research at the state level, but it would be very interesting for you to survey your folks as to whether or not there are agencies within states that are doing this on their own. Because as you can see, this is a very big deal for hiring the most qualified person and getting cost out of the mind. In other words, we know it's illegal to do it, but that doesn't mean that somebody doesn't look at this balance and come up with a non-discriminatory justification for hiring somebody else. This just takes it out of the equation. A lot of companies are doing this now because they recognize the issue that is raised by having the department or the office pay for the accommodations.
Yeah. Well, and I recall when we had Minnesota on an earlier call, they were sharing the various different ways that they can utilize these funds. Variety of different ways that they're using the dollars in the state, loaning equipment, different accommodations that they need. So it's a great resource. Do you recall, because I don't, Bobby, as they were talking, is there any commingling of federal funds, or is it all state funds? Do you recall?
This, I believe, is all state funds.
Okay. All right. And we'll see if we can do some more research and find out and share that with everyone as well. All right, Bobby, we've got about 10 minutes left. Let's dig into the last core
Let-
strategy, and then we're
We
going to
got
ask
two more quickly.
two more. Great.
One is technology. And in this day and age, so much is done online, either internet or intranet, and including application process. And the question is, are we unintentionally developing our online systems, our websites that are not accessible to and usable by everybody, including people with disabilities? So a number of states, California, Colorado, recent legislation in Colorado is basically have developed explicit accessibility standards for technology. There's something called WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's internationally developed, and they have they've had 1.0, 2.0, now they have 2.1, and a number of states have incorporated either these WCAG standards or what's called Section 508 of the Rehab Act, which requires federal agencies' technology be accessible. And so a number of states have either incorporated the WCAG or the 508 standards, California being one of the more, Colorado being one of the more recent comprehensive states in this regard. This is obviously a big deal in terms of the whole hiring process, the recruiting process. And there are a number of implementation issues that states are paying particular attention to. Is the policy being circulated across all state agencies and all departments within? Is there a team that includes human resources folks to an accessibility working team that for implementation? Is there evaluation and testing? Is there feedback? Is there training and guidance, like you were referring to in a different context? Are the folks trained in terms of to ensure that their online systems are accessible? And in this regard, the General Services Administration in the Department of, at the federal level, has developed what I consider the best guide for web accessibility I've ever seen anywhere. And it's all included in a link which Katya will put in the chat room. Under the guide is called Integrating Accessibility into Agency DEIA Implementation Plans. And this document is just absolutely phenomenal in terms of spelling out all of the questions you could possibly have in terms of how to make a webinar accessible, how to make a PowerPoint accessible, how to have the right contract terms in when you procure new technology. It just gives in one place everything that you might want to look in. And one of the things that are particularly helpful is what's called a playbook. And they have a bunch of plays ranging from developing the policy to establishing teams, to making sure the community is involved, integrating accessibility in the research, acquisition, design processing, testing processing, and educating the workforce. And a number of states are taking lead and looking at this very seriously.
Bobby, if I can query you just a little bit more on the inclusive procurement, P&Ps. When you're talking about procurement, are you talking about a state government operational procurement system where
Yeah.
they're securing technology for all their state employees?
and they may contract out in terms of web design.
Mhm.
They may contract out with respect to the application process to make it online. It is to making sure that when you contract it out, that the contractor understands its responsibility to make sure that the online application system is accessible to and usable by people with disabilities.
Fantastic. So we're going to grab all these links that Katia is putting in. We'll add them to today's recording on NASCA's Knowledge Center. But, you know, for those on the call, NASCA members oversee procurement, and that's a huge issue. So they may not be aware of this resource. So we want to make sure we get it into everyone's hands. All right, Bobby, let's look
Is
at
Texas quick? Is Texas on the phone? They are basically the go-to folks in terms of procurement.
we will get some information from Texas and have them share any resources with us as
Okay, great.
well. We're down to just a couple minutes left.
Sure.
Let's wrap up with our training session on that last slide.
Okay, and the last slide is the training that you brought up before this, just disability training in general, etiquette training, but this is obviously a core issue of you can have the best policies in the world, and one of the core issues of implementation is making sure folks are aware of the policies and know best promising and emerging practices. So and some states mandate testing, some not testing, training. Some they literally build into the legislation or the executive order that folks be trained. And Florida has mandatory training, for example. Illinois requires each agency to send at least one hiring manager to be trained each year. Massachusetts has 2 levels of training that are required for beginners as well as advanced. Minnesota executive order provides for training of managers, as does Missouri. Nevada recent legislation requires training of supervisors and managerial employees. So it's we have other references for what examples of training, but this is the policy that says training is a big deal.
Great. All right. Very, very helpful. Well, thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you, Bobby, the entire C team. This has been a great conversation. Thanks to everyone for dropping your thoughts into the chat. Before you drop off, let me just ask one global question. As I mentioned to you, NASCA is going to be working towards a toolkit that will include a set of recommendations, key takeaways, opportunities for states to continue to expand and grow their best practices and their innovative strategies. Once we get that in your hands, what's the best way for your teams to grow and learn? Do you want more webinars? Is it important for us to help you with state-based training, building out regional cohorts, other group learning experiences, just pure written responses and resources? Drop anything in chat that would be helpful for the NASCA team as we continue to partner with the State Exchange on getting this information in your hands, making sure that it's widely accessible to everyone on your teams. So let us know again how best we can be a resource to you. I know oftentimes it's great when you can get in the room with your colleagues, learn from each other, everyone can share and learn as you're going along. So I do agree that it's great to zone in on these specific core strategies. We'll continue to expand that. And again, we so appreciate you all being with us here today. Stay tuned for more information from the State Collaborative. We're going to be meeting with some of our state members later this month to vet some more information. And then we'll be back with you all with more information. So thanks to you again. Thanks, Bobby, for being with us. You all have a fantastic rest of your afternoon. We'll see you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Bobby.
Pam. Bye.
Did you want to stay on for a debrief or just we're good?
whatever you'd like, Bobby. We're glad to do that.
Kathy, are you still